And so what I'm going to talk through a little bit today is a bit about what I will call the digital supply chain. Now, this has always taken a bit of a different perspective where our view of supply chain focuses predominantly on hardware and firmware. So I have a little video running behind me right now. And the supply chain side of things that we traditionally think about is always the perspective of things like trucks or physical supply chain. How do I get material from A to B? But in a changing landscape, we have scenarios where now the digital supply chain comes into play. How does software come into my organization? How does firmware come into my organization? How does hardware get there as well? So when we think about what happens operationally from a supply chain perspective, we now have to think about new risks, new vulnerabilities, and of course, new threats that can impact resiliency and operational capabilities of our organizations. So that's what I'm going to focus my time on today is one, how do we protect against these kinds of new next generation supply chain threats, as well as what the impact of these are to our organization if they are either exploited or, and of course, how we mitigate against them. So I'm going to talk again about how we leverage artificial intelligence as part of digital supply chain cybersecurity. Now, first off, the term digital supply chain cybersecurity is a huge mouthful, and that requires a little bit of definition. When I think of digital supply chain, the first thought that comes into my mind are things like all the traditional software that we're used to having in an organization, our open source libraries, our repositories that we're getting code from, our CI/CD pipelines, and of course our production code that's in place. Now, we already have tools, and we have our defense and depth infrastructure built around how we can inventory this, how we can do vulnerability management, how we can do things like threat detection. But when we start to adjust and look at this from a holistic perspective, and we add in infrastructure components to this, so enterprise IT infrastructure, so your endpoints, your desktops and servers, your cloud infrastructure, your network infrastructure, suddenly now we have other components, hardware components, UEFI or BIOS or firmware components, system software, and of course, every hand that has touched that device before it's arrived inside of your organization. So suddenly we don't have good methodologies for inventory, vulnerability management, and threat detection. So I call this ultimately the supply chain cybersecurity problem, where we have to blindly trust manufacturers, and every time we purchase a piece of equipment, we don't know who's touched it before it's arrived at our building. We have zero visibility on the device's integrity, and we don't really have standardized approaches for receiving information or bill of materials about those devices. You might get a bill of material that says, you've received one device of X make and model, but what does that actually entail? So I want organizations to have a layer of transparency to understand that hidden layer, the hidden code in a device, ensuring that you can see if a device has been compromised, modified, tampered with, and ultimately have that full perspective of the health and security of a physical device inside of your organization. So I have an example here from the Government Accountability Office of the United States about a simple major manufacturer's laptop device. That laptop touched 39 countries on 6 continents, or pieces of it, and was manufactured at 10 in-house factories and 15 other locations with 65 direct suppliers, 200 subordinate suppliers, and ultimately touched over 300 factories before it arrived at that organization. Now that to me is astounding that a device can have 300 different suppliers to make a simple laptop. And that ultimately makes me question, are all of those component suppliers trustworthy, or am I just buying the name of the final supplier that's integrating everything together? So when I think about attackers though, I'm an ex-practitioner, ex-red teamer, and I've often thought of how do I move up in the stack to attack more organizations and make my life easier. So instead of going after a specific victim, I'll look at what other susceptible victims that they have and go after them to make it easier for me. And if I, as an organization, am not checking devices coming into my organization, then it's very easy for me to go to a lesser secured supplier to me to get an easy way into my organization. So when we look at the news, this is becoming a more and more pervasive attack vector. We're seeing about vendors being hacked. We're hearing about leaked source code. We're hearing about leaked signing keys. And when we end up in scenarios where a major manufacturer has a signing key leaked that's trusted by millions and even billions of devices out there, now we're in a scenario where we can't revoke those keys, or otherwise we compromise resiliency of our existing worldwide devices. We also hear stories of backdoors and vulnerabilities being discovered that have been out there for years. We hear about a processor vulnerability that's been out there in every generation of a processor, or the ever-present geopolitical threats. We have to worry about our neighbors and our friends and how we can encounter scenarios where they're trying to attack us through companies that they control. So when we think of it from this perspective and we look at data that exists out there, Microsoft does a security signals report where they ask that, what kind of attacks have your organization encountered? And organizations have said, enterprises specifically have said that they've encountered at least one firmware attack in the last 2 years out of 4 out of 5 enterprises. Now, when they were asked the follow-up question of, what do you actually do about your firmware data? 21% of them says, we actually don't do anything related to that. And I find this common with almost every organization that I speak to, that I go, what are you doing about firmware? And they go, well, it's in our CMDB, but that's about the extent of what we do. We try to patch, but we end up in scenarios where we can't actually find out the data or maintain it, or at risk of taking down an environment, modify it. So my call to action is ultimately bringing transparency to this process. So I work with federal governments and enterprises to build controls or policy to try to require manufacturers to allow this layer of transparency. And I see this in 3 different areas. First is visibility. We need the ability to see what subcomponents are within a device, and ultimately, when I receive a piece of equipment, understand what's within it. Integrity is the ability to verify those components as genuine. So this is things like being able to go and trust and track a supply chain. And then security is reduction of vulnerabilities, identification of said vulnerabilities, and of course, risks and misconfigurations and change. So I say, shouldn't blindly trust any equipment. There's 2 sides of this. One is the stuff that's already out there in an environment to regularly assess it and patch those devices. And this falls into a zero trust pillar around let's trust the actual hardware itself. Now, the other side is new devices. And I know I'm susceptible of this, as are probably everyone in the room. I get that new shiny device. First thing I do is unwrap it, take it out of the box, connect it to my wireless network, and configure it. I don't know what's on that device. I don't know how I should trust it. So I look at this in a few different ways. First is how we can get access to that device. So on the left side, you'll see a sensor. Now, a sensor can be called by other nomenclature, like an agent, a security software, or a network scanner. The idea is let's scan these devices in an organization and collect as much information as they'll give us. And that's things like the actual firmware that's on it, that's configuration information, and that's ultimately every subcomponent or embedded piece within that system. Now, when we collate that data, that's where we can start to do some very interesting things against it. And that's things like assessing it for threats, IOCs. That's looking at things like indicators of attack, indicators of compromise, vulnerabilities, configuration risks, tracking for change. So before a device leaves your organization, goes somewhere and comes back, let's see if anything's changed from a hardware and firmware perspective. And then the last piece is that known good verification. Is it what it says it is? And has it been modified from what the manufacturer shipped? So this is where I want to start talking a little bit about AI. And when we think about all of this information that we gather off this device, we can start to use technologies to bring that together to do some really cool stuff. So when I get something like a firmware binary, first thing, of course, that I can check is, have I seen this before? What is its existing reputation? Is it known good? Is it known bad? Do we not know about it? Then I can start to employ tools against it that we would typically have something like a security engineer do. Let's disassemble it. Let's decompile it. Let's run it in a sandbox and see what exactly it does. And the output from these components, again, give us another layer of information. Things like, can I pull out functions out of this binary and compare it to functions that I've seen before, both good and bad? It also lets me do things like think about, does something actually do what it's supposed to be doing? So again, using a reference from something like UEFI, if I see a function within UEFI that's trying to write to an NTFS Windows partition, suddenly that doesn't make sense and it looks a little funky. And now in that scenario, I can find unique and interesting things. It also lets me start to take some of this data to find parallel types of threats and vulnerabilities. So we collect firmware from every major manufacturer. And when you think of that, we have a data set of, let's say, 20 million firmware binaries. Now, if I find a new vulnerability in one on a brand new piece of equipment, what's the first thing I'm going to do? So I'm going to go and check that against our existing database and see what other makes and models have that vulnerability within it through similarities. Now that gives me a very interesting perspective because now I can go back to the manufacturers and go, you disclose that this vulnerability applies to 10 makes and models. We actually find that it applies to 2,000 models. And so whenever you see a firmware-related vulnerability out there, you'll likely see our name attached to it because we generally find those and then expose them or should say responsibly disclose them. Now, what we're doing, and one of the things that you'll see up here is I highlight LLMs. We get a lot of output of data from our test environments and when we collect new firmware. This lets us feed output from our systems into LLMs. And so we can take code, functions, and bits of information from our analyses, feed it into an LLM, and ask it questions, and have it start to do some of this work that typically our research and our engineering teams would do. And based upon that work, we can then use it to accelerate our development against security technologies on these situations. We can use it to build new models, new patterns of information, new things that we should be searching for within our solution, and feed that back into our data set to improve the quality of it. Now, this also means that when we look at it from where we have been, we used to build, and almost every security technology is nothing more than a whole bunch of if, then, else statements. We look at things and we say, these statements are slow to adapt, they're very, very high cost from a development standpoint, they're tough to maintain, and they oftentimes have a high chance of inaccuracy. We end up in a scenario where someone changes one rule, it goes out to millions of machines, and to refer back to the first talk, they blue screen. Now, where we can get to, and I'm hopeful that all security technologies take this leap, is start going into using AI to do that initial development of technology. So in our case, we've started using LLMs to generate initial rule sets. We're able to generate 1,000% more rule sets in a standard development cycle that allows us to suddenly increase our efficacy tremendously. Now, this ultimately gives us the capability to generate the information, but still not necessarily trust it. Now, in our case, we look at this data and we go, okay, some of these rule sets are great, some of them are way out and not something we should trust. But where we tend to focus is starting to enhance this AI component, this LLM, starting to add external components to it so that we can integrate this into QA and testing cycles to do automated improvements in quality in it. And that's why I say LLM in the middle, but I say AI on the right. Imagine being able to go and take rule sets, automatically test them against our data set of 20 million plus firmware, and come back and say, okay, this is the efficacy of this rule set with existing data. So this is going to ultimately allow us to increase our velocity for how we can develop technologies. This gets to be very, very simple when you look at it in this slide here. I take a website on the left that has a security vulnerability. I use an LLM to read that website and change it to programmatic code. In this case, let's go and take the data off this website, put it into JSON or XML or whatever the case is, and then ask simple questions against that data. In this case, I can go and say, hey, does this security advisory pertain to firmware? Is this an out-of-memory condition? Is this an exploit or an escalation of privilege? And I can start to use AI to quickly read and process things which we would have had to do previously with scripting and rule sets. And now I can start to add metadata to my scraped data from manufacturers and increase the quality of it. This also means that I can start to use this to feed other processes. You know, the reference earlier of 600 new CVEs are released. How many of those CVEs actually apply to my technology and the things that I actually care about? So, taking this back to when I look at devices, I see that the device is broken up into ultimately a bunch of different pillars. And when we look at what we do today, we focus on the top. You know, we focus in that area of the host operating system, applications, user space. But we largely ignore the areas in red. You know, we have mature technologies to protect the traditional initial vectors of attack, but we don't have technologies that really protect us at the hardware layer. Again, hardware, firmware. So that's why I encourage every organization to inspect every component at every layer to get a full perspective of risk of a device in their organization and make sure they're not missing something within that device itself. So, in summary, when I think of all the devices that come into an organization, it takes a lot to realize just how many hands that device has touched. You know, you think it touches 300 different factories, but then you've also likely purchased that through a value-added reseller, a strategic integrator, or just a retailer. And that device has now touched multiple hands even through there. And it's very easy for someone to unseal a box, modify something, and then reseal it. And when we think of attackers moving upstream to find weak spots and weak suppliers, this now gives them a ripe territory to attack to get into organizations. So moving to inspecting every layer within a device reduces your operational risk, makes it easier to prevent future threats of attackers moving to a different area. And it also means that we can start to use advanced technologies to accelerate our solutions on the vendor side to better protect your organizations. So, just wanted to say thank you again. I've really enjoyed my trip, and I'm enjoying all of the information that I'm learning from this event, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.